We're very pleased to have Delegate Tim Hugo, who represents the 40th District, with us tonight. With the last redistricting, he added some of Prince William County to his territory, which included some of Gainesville, where he is now my delegate. But he represents Centerville, Clifton, Fairfax, Fairfax Station, as well as Cat Harpin, Gainesville, Haymarket, and Manassas in Prince William County now. He serves as the Majority Caucus Chairman for the House Republican Caucus, and I think that puts him third in line in the seniority there. He's also Vice Chairman of the Finance Committee and serves on the Commerce and Labor, Transportation, and Privileges and Election Committee. So he's a busy guy down there in Richmond. Professionally, he's Executive Director of the Free File Alliance, which is a public partnership between a coalition of tax preparation companies and the IRS. I had no idea they had coalitions that work to provide free filing for federal income tax returns for low and moderate income citizens. In his early career, he worked on Capitol Hill, including being Chief of Staff to Congressman Bud Schuster, and he was a special assistant earlier to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs. He's a William & Mary graduate, and he lives in Clifton with his wife and 4 children. Tonight, I particularly want to mention that he has been chief patron of legislation to curb human trafficking, which strengthened the crime of domestic minor sex trafficking and established evidentiary protections for testifying victims. And I'm sure, he's going to tell you more about that, and you're going to hear more about that kind of legislation. So let me turn this over to Delegate Tim Hugo.
Thank you. Well, Martha, thank you very much, and thanks to the Prince William Committee of 100 for having me this evening, and for Denny and Martha for all their work putting this together. It's an honor to be here. And just for record, the shirt I wore tonight, I'm not trying to be partisan because I see friends from both parties here. Beforehand, if any of you know Scott Surville, a great guy, Democrat out of Mount Vernon, he and I taped a show on the History Channel, and it's going to show up in the fall, and they asked me to wear a red shirt, and he had to wear a blue shirt. I thought he got a better deal because I had about 12 blue shirts and I had to go out and buy this today. But thank y'all for having me here tonight to talk about something I think is a very critical topic that not enough people talk about, because I don't think enough people know about it. Human trafficking in general and underage sex trafficking in particular, it's some of the fastest growing criminal activities in the United States. And here is the thing, and we were talking about it at dinner a little bit. I didn't know it happened here. You just don't think. A friend of mine who used to work for me, and she's an attorney now, came to me and said, Tim, I want you to talk to Linda Smith. She's a former congresswoman, and she's at an organization called Shared Hope. And Linda was a congresswoman from Washington State. She flew in and sat in my office, and she said, I need to talk to you about legislation, about comprehensive legislation that we want to do and some ideas. And I said, Linda, and Tabitha, I focus on my district. I focus on business taxes, commerce. I said, this is just not something I know enough about. You tend to gravitate to the things you know. And they went through this, and they said, Tim, it's happening right here. And it's happening, people say, and I was like, doesn't this just happen in Thailand? I'm like, no, it happens here in Centerville. It happens in Fairfax. It happens in Prince William. And the thing that I learned, the more I got into it, it doesn't just happen everywhere. It happens to every type of family. Some people think, this doesn't happen to my family or this type of family or that. It happens to every type of family. And like I said, I had no idea how prevalent this was, but according to Shared Hope International and Polaris, which we've worked with, 100,000 American children are exploited each year through prostitution. 100,000. Again, 2 years ago, I had no idea. So last year, I sponsored some legislation which made some of these things increase in penalties, felonies. And it passed into law, and it was signed. We had the governor, and it was bipartisan legislation. That's why I say tonight, I see Democrat friends, I see Republican friends. This is not a partisan issue. This is an important issue that Republicans, Democrats, Independents have to come together on, because these are our kids. And that's when Tabitha and Linda Smith were talking to me, and I was thinking, I was like, I do commerce issues, I do business. But I've got 4 young kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. And so this was something, like I said, I wasn't familiar with. And I'll be honest, I wasn't particularly comfortable about talking about sex and prostitution in public. But then I thought, you know what, I can get over this discomfort, because these young men and young women are being trafficked and being hurt every day. And my discomfort is nothing compared to what these kids are going through. So we've done that last year. We put, again, bipartisan, we worked on a number of bills this year that I believe the governor is going to be coming to Northern Virginia in the next few weeks or month. He asked us for a location to sign the other day. I think we might do it at one of the high schools, because I don't know if you heard the other day, some kids from high school, because with MS-13, were trafficked. Fairfax County, Alexandria, Northern Virginia. It happens right here. Well, today we are honored to have 4 people who are working on this issue day in and day out, and I appreciate all of their work, because, again, it's probably not fun, probably not pretty, but it's rewarding. And I was talking to Faye, it's rewarding when you see these kids who come out of it, who make it out, who do something different, who break out of this tyranny, which is this trafficking and prostitution. And one of the things, and we've had a number of press conferences here to talk about, again, things you don't have. We have a halfway house in Northern Virginia to help these young women, this one's for young women, to break out of this. Well, I am honored today to have Detective Barry Crone, who's here. He's a member of the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force and co-chairs the training committee. You know, he's been provided training in the area of human trafficking for the Attorney General's office and several Northern Virginia police departments. He's a case agent for all human trafficking investigations within Prince William County Police. And Barry, every police officer is important, but there may not be a more important one for some of our more vulnerable citizens than you. Thank you very much. Barry?
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, being that tonight is about training and awareness, I think it's important to say what human trafficking is and what it's not. And what human trafficking is not is people think trafficking and they think of smuggling. Well, you know, trafficking basically means for sale. And when you talk about human trafficking, you're talking about people for sale. It doesn't mean that they had to come across a border somewhere or be smuggled into our country. Delegate Hugo already mentioned that we have 100,000 U.S. kids that are being trafficked every year in domestic minor sex trafficking. So what human trafficking is, the best way I've heard it explained is it is financial in intent. People want to make money, and the way that they're doing that is through a civil rights violation. It's a civil rights violation in action because what they're doing is they're exploiting someone's situation in order to make money. A lot of times, especially in law enforcement, we want to put everything in a box. Human trafficking can't be put in a box. You know, in law enforcement, we say a burglary is this. It's when somebody breaks and enters into a residence or a dwelling and takes things. Well, human trafficking has so many different elements. We talk about sex trafficking in the commercial sex trade when someone's put into that trade through force, fraud, or coercion. But we also have labor trafficking, where people are put into forced labor through force, fraud, or coercion. One of the best, the abduction statute in Virginia that was amended back in 2010 laid it out very, very nicely. It said, anyone who puts somebody into forced labor or services through threat or intimidation is guilty of abduction. That person's not consenting to the actions that the person has put them into. And the threatening behavior can include withholding an immigration document, taking an immigration document, or threatening to report one as being illegal in the United States. So think of the situation of the immigrant worker working in a restaurant who's told you're going to work 12-hour days for $4 an hour because you're illegal, and if you don't, I'm going to call immigration. And that is human trafficking in its greatest sense. So a lot of times, sex trafficking kind of takes the forefront, but there's a lot of cases of labor trafficking. The statistics show a heavy percentage in the sex trafficking arena. I can tell you, as a case agent here in Prince William County, and working with the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force, I work just as many forced labor cases as I do sex trafficking cases. And I work with domestic minor sex trafficking cases. I work with foreign national adults, specific networks, and I work the forced labor situations in the restaurants. I don't want to. I don't think it's good just to talk and talk. I'll look forward to your questions at the end, and I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Well, I will say that while myself and the governor and the attorney general and Democrats, Republicans in the House and Senate, and Barry, Officer Cronin, are saying that these criminals are not welcome in Virginia, our next speaker, Faye Phillips, is saying to these young women, here is a welcoming face. Here is somebody here to listen to you and to help you. Faye is a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Virginia. She is the coordinator of Youth for Tomorrow, which crisis intervention counseling services, which if you haven't been out to Youth for Tomorrow, it's an incredible facility. Wonderful what they do for these young children. She founded Girls on a Journey program for domestic minor sex trafficked victims on the campus of Youth for Tomorrow. She's a member of the D.C. Task Force, and she has over 30 years of clinical experience in the greater Washington metropolitan area. She's been a service provider for sex trafficked victims in our area since 2007, and she credits Shared Hope International, Polaris, and Restoration Ministries for their efforts to educate our nation. Hey, thank you for what you've done, and thank you for helping these young women. Thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Okay, I know we have 12 minutes, so just help me with the time, because sometimes when I'm talking about this population, I tend to get a little carried away. In terms of being carried away, I tend to have two different emotions. One of being elated and happy, the fact that we're able to get these girls off the street. But then the flip side of it is anger, because it's taken us so long to put things in place to help these young people. Not everybody wants to be out on the streets. We have girls who want to come in, they want to help, but on the other side, we have those who are forced out there. Girls who are running away from home because there's some dysfunction going on in their family. They need help. Girls who are lured into this population by the quote-unquote boyfriend or the guy that tells them what they want to hear when they want to hear it to pull them in. Next thing they know, wow, you're out on the street working the track. We have all types of ways that these girls are lured into this field. But let us not forget the males. We also have male victims who are also trafficked. Now, I want to share with you the definition by the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2005 that describes domestic minor sex trafficking according to the federal law. Domestic minor trafficking occurs when a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident who has not attained 18 years of age is engaged in a commercial sex act. Now, I wear two roles or two hats at Youth for Tomorrow. I started the Girls on a Journey program, which is a program to help these young girls regain their life. We're talking about girls who have been through serious brainwashing, girls who have been threatened, girls who have been beaten, girls who have been addicted to drugs. You name it, whatever a pimp can do to keep these girls in line, these young ladies have experienced this. And we're talking about as young as 12 years old. So from 12 years old to the age of 18, we have girls out there on the street who have gone through tremendous horror. Post-traumatic stress is a living nightmare for them day in and day out. Having flashbacks to the point where you can't sit in class to get your education, knowing that in this day and age, you have to have your education in order to make it in this world. But you can't because you're thinking about the nightmares, the horrors of being beaten, the horrors of having to sleep with so many men on one night. I met a young lady at the age of 15. Now, this young lady was trafficked here from Ohio. And it was amazing to me in the conversation, she mentioned Georgia Avenue. Well, we know that's right here in Washington, D.C. So, again, we talk about trafficking, taking young girls across state lines. One weekend on Georgia Avenue, her pimp forced her to sleep with over 30 men. She's 15. That's nothing compared to some of the other stores in terms of what some of these young girls go through. Now, my job, whenever I'm able to speak on the subject, is to just put enough fright or whatever you want to call it, have you sitting on the edge of your seat to know that this situation is serious. It's right here in Prince William County. Barry and I are working with a case right now, a young lady in Woodbridge. She had been missing from home for over a year. She's only 14 years old. We're talking about her being out there age 13. But some things happened to her prior to that. Woodbridge, ladies and gentlemen. Manassas, ladies and gentlemen. Bristol, ladies and gentlemen. It's here. One of the things I like to tell people, if you see anything that looks odd, anything out of the norm, it's no harm in picking up the phone and say, look, I think something's going on next door to me. Or I think something is going on around the corner. Or I've been seeing a group of young people congregating in a certain place. Or I see men going in and out of the house. Call it in. There's tip hotlines. You're going to get in trouble for it, but you'll be surprised at the lives you might save just because of what you see. Now, we know law enforcement, they're out doing what they do. They're not everywhere. Just like in my field. You don't have a lot of people all over the place doing what I do. But we have a lot of people in the audience. We have a lot of people in the communities, a lot of people in the state. And that's why it is so very important that education is key in terms of what's going on with our young people in the United States of America. Yes, we hear a lot about the international trafficking. Yes, that's important too. But we got a lot going on right here. A couple of years ago, there was a case, a young lady, she was an infant, she was a toddler, 4 years old. Parents sold her for drugs. Guess what? This baby ended up dying. But thank God the police were able to apprehend the gentleman involved as well as the mother because they were carrying her out of a hotel and a hotel camera picked them up. Wow, thank God for the camera because guess what? Had that not been the case, who knows? This child's murder may not have been solved. And it's just so many cases that happens out there that touches the heart, touches the mind, but gives you that energy to be a rebel, to go out and fight for the cause, to do what we need to do to educate the population that human sex trafficking, domestic minor sex trafficking is true. And I'm going to stop on that note because I'm getting riled up.
No. Hey, you tell a compelling story. You get riled up all you want. This is the right one to get riled up on. Thank you very much. Our next is Special Agent James Haverty. He's currently assigned to the Northern Virginia Resident Agency of the Washington Field Office of the FBI, located here in Manassas. He's the supervisor of the Organized Crimes and Civil Rights Squad covering the Northern Virginia area in D.C. He's been with the FBI 22 years. And over the course, he's worked in D.C., San Diego. He's worked organized crimes, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, white-collar crime, and civil rights. He served 3 years at headquarters, and he has been in the management for the last 6 years. He's married with 4 children, and we appreciate you being here tonight to tell us what the FBI is doing and how you see this problem that I think is an underreported or under-recognized problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to tell you it's a real pleasure to be here and be able to talk about something that I feel very passionately about, and I've been able to make a career out of working something I feel passionately about. I put evil people in jail. That's my function in life, and human trafficking is a great part of having an opportunity to put truly evil people in jail. I think the interesting thing to talk to you about tonight would be to describe to you how the FBI fits in with this problem in your area. I have a squad that was set up in the last year, and I was asked to assemble this new squad in the Washington field office. And we had not been working organized crime in certain areas. And the areas that my management wanted to start focusing on was some of the non-traditional organized crime emerging groups that haven't been looked at before because we were focusing on Latin drug organizations, gangs, Italians, and others. We needed in Washington, D.C. to focus on some of these other groups. And when you're looking at organized crime, they cater to the various vices that people want. And, narcotics is one of those, and prostitution is another example. So many organized crime groups are involved in the perpetuation of human trafficking. So that marriage of the civil rights program, which I am also responsible for, and organized crime made sense because of the intersection of human trafficking. Because organized crime groups run human trafficking operations, and we also need to investigate human trafficking. So we're looking for human trafficking by investigating things like prostitution and slave labor, and when we're looking for those types of things, we might also identify human trafficking organized crime groups. And where the FBI really shows a real benefit in the law enforcement community is our ability to attack large-scale organizations and do long-term investigations that utilize sophisticated techniques. That's usually what we bring to the table to focus on an emerging problem. So we are using those types of techniques to try to identify groups that are running human trafficking organizations. The challenge there is it may not always necessarily fall into the category of human trafficking. If it's a prostitution operation, for example, we actually did an investigation for 6 months that included utilizing a wiretap to go after a prostitution operation. And in the entire investigation, we were unable to find any trafficking because every single prostitute involved in this operation was voluntary. But we did find a criminal enterprise. We took down a criminal organization, and now we're on to the next one to try to find them. So this is just an example of the kind of techniques that we bring to the table. We engage with the task force and work with them, and we try to find operations where we can maybe take out an entire organization that runs these type of operations. And we treat them like they're an organized crime group. So whether they're running illegal labor operations and forcing people into labor, slave-type labor operations, whether they're running prostitution operations, or whether they're doing something even more unusual like magazine crews, things like that where people are compelled to participate and they can't walk away when they want to. Those are the kinds of cases that will work. We have limited resources and we have to prioritize what we work, but that's kind of a force multiplier when we are focusing on organized crime and human trafficking, because we can combine resources and work both at the same time, if that makes sense. So I've found it to be very enriching, and it's been a very challenging field, because one of the things that we face is trying to get these people who are being trafficked to actually acknowledge that they're being trafficked. We can go and as we found out when we go out and we work with the task force, that you can interview, for example, prostitutes, and at first blush in the presence of their employer, they're not going to acknowledge that they're being held against their will, especially when they're of certain ethnic cultures where that's just not something that they do. And so it's a very challenging process to try and bring them to the point where they'll actually acknowledge it. But if we use some of our techniques that where we can catch them talking about it when they think they're secure, and they actually discuss the enslavement, we don't necessarily have to rely on the witnesses. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to attack this problem at a higher level and take out organizations that are running these types of operations. And hopefully we'll be able to do that with this combined effort. With this kind of technique, I think that, we should be able to identify organized crime groups that are also importing these folks. And I think that one of the things you have to keep in mind is there are certain ethnic groups that participate in this, and it requires us to have coordination within our own agency across multiple areas of functionality. We actually have a different group that works crimes against children. So we have to coordinate with them because they're investigating cybercrime and this whole internet attacking of children. We coordinate with them. We also have to coordinate with a whole group of people that work gangs, because we have to coordinate with the folks that are working MS-13, because those types of gang operations run human trafficking operations. And we coordinate with the task force as well. And we don't just work in Northern Virginia. We also have D.C. is our responsibility as well. So that allows, one of the other advantages that the FBI can bring to the table is some of these organizations, they don't just stay within a Prince William County and operate within Prince William County. They actually take these women and they move them from, say, for example, Prince William County to D.C., to Maryland, to Pennsylvania, to New York, and they're constantly cycling them around and moving around to different locations. So what we try to do is we try to focus on the... You can imagine that to move people to different locations, there has to be somebody coordinating that kind of movement and making those arrangements. So we have the ability to try and work with a New York office, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., down south if we have to, so that we can try and work together and track these things as they move around. And that type of group that's moving people around like that, that's what we need to go after, and that's what we have to try to eliminate. And the way I look at it is in the course of my career, as I oversee these agents when they're conducting these investigations, if we can actually successfully bring down several operations like this, we're going to find people that are being trafficked, and we're going to neutralize organizations that are running operations like this and start to knock this stuff back. And we're going to do that by taking out the people that are running the operations. I don't want to just take out one massage parlor. I don't want to just take out one brothel. I want to take out the guys that are actually moving girls between 5, 6, 7, 8 brothels in 4 or 5 cities and get them and create a deterrence where they'll start thinking maybe this isn't necessarily the best profitable operation for me to be involved in, and maybe I need to find something else to do because this is dangerous because I could go to prison. And some of the federal laws that we're bringing to bear, if these guys actually utilize violence and they utilize weapons, and we combine some of the other logical charges that come in with running a prostitution or a slavery type operation, we can actually pile that stuff on and combine that into maybe a RICO prosecution and actually put some people away for some significant time. We arrested some folks a while back that were running a prostitution operation in Virginia, D.C., a little bit in Maryland. And with some of the violence that the pimp-type behavior involves, we were looking at potentially putting some of these people away for 40 years. So those are the kinds of sentences that make people think twice as whether or not they want to continue in this business, and maybe they need to find something else to do. So that's what we're trying to do. It's our contribution to solving this problem. It's not something that's going to be solved easily because like drugs and prostitution and drugs are very similar in the sense that as long as people continue to buy the product, someone is going to consistently try to sell it. And I'm not in the business of trying to solve the user side of the function, but when you do bring down a large prostitution operation, you sometimes come across lists of customers. And we have those in our possession, and that's one thing that often makes people very uncomfortable, that they know we have something like that. But that's what we do, and that's our function. And I think that you'll probably have questions for me, and I hope you feel free to ask, because I think I've kind of given you a good overview of what we do, and I welcome your questions when we get to that point.
Jim, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Obviously he talked about his efforts on the organized crime, and we talked a few minutes ago that MS-13 was involved in the trafficking up here. So it's organizations, but it's also individuals. In smaller groups, Delegate Rich Anderson and I were being briefed this year on one of the laws that passed, and we found that some of these small groups, to get into the group, you have to film your children engaged in some of these pornographic things. And it wasn't just teenagers, it was young kids, that what these people were doing. And it is horrific. And that's why I'm glad to help work on this. Because I think in the past, some of these young people have often been looked on as criminals, but I see them as victims. And I know our next speaker, Lisa Johnson-Firth, also looks at that. She's the principal of the law firm Immigrants First in Manassas. She's been practicing immigration law here exclusively since, I think, 2001, and she was the legal director of legal services at an organization providing representation to immigrant women and children. She's the director of legal services at Institute of Policy Studies for the program Break the Chains campaign. And Lisa, thank you for being here tonight. We appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us about what we all think in this room is a incredibly important and tragic subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here and share my personal insights, fill in the gaps, or not maybe gaps, but maybe broaden the perspective of the issue. I came to work on trafficking. I went from being a corporate lawyer in a comfortable law firm in Boston to rescuing domestic workers in Washington, D.C. off the streets and going to World Bank officials' homes and helping domestic workers leave their work environment where they were enslaved by World Bank officials, IMF officials, Organization of American States officials, UN officials, diplomats. Most of the cases that I have worked on in the trafficking context are domestic servitude type situations, have had some sex trafficking cases, have also had some really interesting mail order bride cases. When I was the director of legal services at Tahrir Justice Center, we actually helped author the legislation that got passed that would require the State Department and the consulates abroad to inform women what the background was of the men that they were marrying in the United States. Because you got to think twice. If an American guy can't find a woman anywhere in the United States and he's got to go to Ukraine or Russia to get a woman, there's probably something in his background. And quite often there is. There's history of domestic violence, protective orders, crimes of assault and battery. And so these women were coming here with no knowledge whatsoever of who they were marrying. And what was really interesting is they had to go through a background check, but their husbands didn't. And so we actually helped get the law passed, international marriage broker legislation, passed that would require women to be notified of the background of the men that they were marrying. So I've sort of been involved in all sides of it other than the law enforcement side, but I have worked with the Department of Justice and local law enforcement to have traffickers prosecuted in the context of the immigration context. Because in 2000, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed, and it actually formulated two very important visas for victims of trafficking and victims of crime. One is the T visa, it's for victims of trafficking. The other is the U visa for victims of crime. And one of the requirements of those visas is that the person cooperate with law enforcement, because the whole idea behind that legislation was protection of the victim and prosecution of the trafficker or the person who had committed a crime. So I've been involved on the immigration side of doing T and U visas for victims of trafficking, as well as feeling very much like a social worker, because when you're working with a person who's been trafficked, there's a tremendous need for many kinds of services, from counseling to handle the post-trauma, to medical services for sexually transmitted diseases and all sorts of problems that they're having medically. Maybe they haven't even seen a doctor for years or been to a dentist. If you're working with foreign nationals, helping them get services to acclimate to the United States. So there is a significant problem with U.S. citizens. I'm working with foreign nationals in the work that I do. And I think the two relate. And I think we need to be concerned about the foreign nationals who are trafficked into our area, because it's linked to a broader issue of why do we have so many immigrants flooding into the United States, and why do we have so many trafficked persons flooding into the United States. There's a report, the TIP report, Trafficking in Persons report. It's put out by the State Department. It's been published for 11 years now. And that report ranks countries into tiers in terms of their effectiveness of dealing with trafficking in persons. And the United States, not surprisingly, is a Tier 1 country. We have passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We have the FBI and Department of Justice and other agencies working on this issue. But obviously there's a lot of countries that are not in compliance, and there's trade ramifications for those countries and other economic sanctions that are not in full compliance with, trying to eliminate trafficking in their countries. So although the United States is not a source necessarily of too many trafficking victims, we are a transit and destination country. We have a lot of trafficked persons coming into the United States. And why is that? I think we're gonna be talking about that. When you listen to some of these statistics, it raises a lot of questions in my mind. The United Nations has estimated that there are 214 million migrants across the globe. That's a 37% increase in the last 2 decades. And I've been working on trafficking issues for the past 11 years. When the Trafficking Protection Act was passed, I was one of the first lawyers working on T&U visas. And I found it interesting that if you look at the TIP report, back when it was first published, the statistics, and these statistics are hard to get a handle on because the crime is secretive by nature and, people are in transit. But the early statistics for trafficking were that there were 700,000 people that were being trafficked. Now, that number has gone up to an incredible 27 million people that they estimate that are trafficked worldwide. And that its profitability has gone from $7 to $10 billion to $40 billion, right up there with drugs and guns trafficking. So hugely profitable. That's certainly one of the reasons that it has become so prolific. Hugely profitable, but there's other reasons for an increase of trafficking. Globalization. Our demand for cheap products has displaced persons around the globe. We, through our trade agreements, through economic restructuring in various countries, have basically forced people, such as in Mexico, subsistence farmers, off the land, and they have nowhere else to go but to migrate north. Some of those persons become vulnerable to being trafficked because they think that they can have a better life somewhere else, and they're made promises by recruiters and traffickers. So that's kind of, there's so much more I could say about, what are the push-pull factors of why people are trafficked. But I do want to touch on some other issues, and that is, one, how do you recognize someone who's been trafficked? Most of the persons that we assisted when I was working with Break the Chain campaign in D.C. came to us because of a good Samaritan who'd spotted something really odd going on with their next-door neighbor. In one case, there was an Indian woman who was working for a diplomat who was being forced to walk the dog in the middle of winter with no shoes, no coat. The neighbors saw this, thought it was odd. They contacted our organization. And when you come across a person that may not speak, not just they don't speak English, we've got plenty of people that don't speak English, but that combined with they may seem disorientated, malnourished, not dressed well, they may not have identification documents or know where they are. There's other indications if you actually talk to them. You might ask them, are you free to leave where you are or where you're living? Has anyone taken your important papers? So sort of if you see sort of strange things happening, you might, inquire of that person if they need assistance, and it may come to light that they are in fact being trafficked or are being held against their will in some sort of forced slavery situation. There's actually a national hotline to report trafficking. It's sort of co-sponsored by the Polaris Project, and that number is 888-3737-888. And the Polaris Project has a phenomenal website of tracking a lot of data on trafficked persons and statistics. And in fact, I was looking at their statistics today, and between January 1st and December 31st of 2011, there were 10 reports of trafficking to the hotline from Manassas, 13 from Woodbridge, 4 from Triangle, and 20 from Fairfax, just to kind of give you some idea of the cases that are coming out, from our own area. So then I sort of want to finish with what can we do to get involved as just sort of normal lay people in the community to assist in this issue. One of the first things you can do is lobby your congressional representative to get the reauthorization of the Trafficking Persons Act passed. The 2011 reauthorization has not happened yet. Virginia was given an F by Protected Innocence Initiative and is also low ranked in other surveys of states that have adequately handled trafficking. We don't have a comprehensive anti-trafficking law in Virginia. We do have other laws. Barry Crone mentioned the abduction statute. But there's a lot of aspects of trafficking that need to be adequately dealt with, and Virginia is one of the few states that does not have a law specifically addressing trafficking. So you can contact your representatives about that. Get involved in terms of hosting a movie or educating your church or book groups. Like I said, keep an eye out for your neighbors and sort of assess what's going on. Donate to the nonprofits. All of the nonprofits in this area, Tahari Justice Center, Ayuda, Hogar Hispano, Catholic Charities, Polaris Project, these nonprofits need financial assistance. They are, for instance, Tahari Justice Center, which is a remarkable organization, is 3 months out for their cases. They cannot handle any more cases because they don't have the lawyer staff to handle these cases. So if you really want to help, donate to some of the nonprofits that are really on the ground helping victims of trafficking. And I think I'll wrap it up with that. Thank you.
Wow. Excellent. What we're going to do now, Lisa, thank you very much. That is incredible. Let us open up the floor. If anybody has questions, and Martha's going to be our expert walking around with the microphone, so we make sure that Jim gets everything on tape.
Jim, how much time do we have?
At least 20 minutes.
Okay.
Just make sure, maybe identify yourself, and then make sure you let us know which panelists you're asking to speak with.
Sure. I'm Ernie Porter from the Occoquan District, and I think this is for Barry primarily, but anybody who could answer it would be welcome. There was some reference earlier, I think, to legislation applying to the existing laws applying to U.S. citizens or permanent legal residents. And then there was also a reference, and I think, Mr. Crone, this is the one that you made, that some of these folks are retained, in a sense, by threats about revealing their immigration status. So my basic question is to law enforcement, what happens when you go in and you find someone who's been trafficked and they're here in the country illegally? What happens to them?
It's a very good question because this is a very complex issue, and it's something that even though law enforcement has been aware of it for a while, been working the cases, it's kind of we're still on a learning curve, and we as law enforcement can't work these cases to get by ourselves. We need everybody sitting at this table. I can be the detective investigating the case, but I can't be the advocate for the victim. I can't offer them services. I can't meet their mental health needs, the physical needs that they need at 3 o'clock in the morning when I've recovered them. That's where the service providers come in. When the investigation crosses state lines and starts getting into the organized crime element, that's when I'm picking up the phone and I'm calling Jim and saying, "Hey, we got a big case here that's crossing state lines, organized crime, and now we need to bring you into it." And then eventually, we need, I teach the victim-centered approach. You have to have your victim healthy, restored to make your case, and part of that is keeping your victim here in the country. And the biggest thing is these people have been threatened by their immigration status. They've probably been told by their traffickers, you can't go to the police because if you do, you'll be arrested and you'll be deported. A lot of these, picture foreign nationals from certain countries that don't have the same kind of law enforcement we have. People from a communist country. They don't feel comfortable coming to law enforcement in the first place. And now you're bringing immigration into the issue. They're scared to death of you. So the last thing we want to do is make good on the trafficker's threats. So we're very cognizant of that, and that's something where eventually that same case is going to touch Lisa because she's going to come in later on in the process to assist with the visa process. But I just broke a case on Friday and identified a foreign national victim, and I'm a designated immigration agent with Homeland Security Investigations, but I have limited immigration authority, and I work closely with other agents, and we offer that that immigrant, if in the case that they're already in removal proceedings, which makes them more vulnerable, and in this case, the trafficker used that against her. I can pick up the phone, call immigration, you'll be gone tomorrow. We're utilizing continued presence. So basically, immigration says, we're going to put this on hold. An immigration judge has ordered you removed, but you are now considered the victim of a crime, and we're going to put this on hold and put this on the back burner. And from there, they are eligible for certain immigration benefits, such as a work authorization card to work here in the United States. Why is that important to me? I want that person to be able to get back on their feet, be able to support themselves, and get in that restoration process so that they can, in fact, stand, testify in court against the trafficker that exploited them. And then in the longer term, we have the trafficking visa, the T visa, or the U visa for victims of crime. That would be more of a long-term solution. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Shario from Woodbridge, and forgive me, this may be obvious to everybody. I just don't know. But you talk about going after the traffickers, and I'm curious. What about the users? If you traffic drugs, yeah, you're a criminal, but you're also picked up if you use it. What about the technical term, Johns? What about the people that are having the slave labor in their house? What is the law enforcement going after the users? How does that work?
Go first.
Yeah, very good question. And when I started in this issue, the drug trafficking was the number one crime amongst organized crime, followed by weapons trafficking, followed by human trafficking. And now weapons trafficking has taken the third place, and now human trafficking is the second largest growing. And the reason for that is awareness. These trafficking networks are exploiting the lack of awareness on the part of law enforcement, and that's why I push awareness so strongly. There's a war on drugs. Police officers and detectives are out on the street every night, and most of them are looking for two things: drugs and DUIs, because that's kind of what's been drilled into them during the academy, and that's what they think police officers should be doing. They're not looking for prostitution. They're not looking for people in domestic servitude or people that are being exploited. And in fact, most of them didn't know the indicators to be looking for in the first place. Now, not every person involved in commercial sex is a human trafficking victim. That's a fact. But there are many that are. And although prostitution is not human trafficking, obviously prostitution feeds and supports human trafficking. It is. And you ask, why do we not go after the Johns? And in fact, we do. We will utilize a tactic of stopping Johns leaving a brothel or a John leaving a hotel room. And what we find ourselves in a situation, like Jim said, we're after the bigger fish. We're after who's at the top of this. And a lot of times you have to maybe cut a deal with the John to get the information that you want to be able to put your charge on the trafficker. And at that point, you need to kind of pick the greater of the two evils. Would I rather arrest the trafficker, or would I rather arrest the John if you're put in that situation? But the demand, and as long as there's demand, there'll be somebody like Jim said, there'll be somebody there to facilitate that crime. It's a difficult situation.
Can I comment on it before we move? Can I answer that also? It's a deep philosophical question that you ask, and I don't think we have the time for me to really get into it. But we've had these discussions in my office, and I think that one of the things we have to remember, my business, his business, is a mean business. We're in a very mean business, and in combating evil, I used the term evil before, it's fisticuffs, it's nasty. So we'll be mean to whoever we have to be mean to accomplish what our goals and objectives are. So in the hierarchy of responsibility in, say, for example, the prostitution and trafficking problem, the people that we want more than anybody are the people that are running the organization, because if we eliminate them, maybe we stop the problem from occurring. And then the next below that are the mid-management, and then on down to the prostitutes. Are we going to prosecute the prostitutes? And then there's the Johns. And yes, John is a technical term that we use in our business. That's what we call them, Johns. And we make the decision most often not to prosecute Johns in what we're doing, but there are certain elements of what we do that create deterrence for Johns. For example, do you think those people are comfortable when they know that there's maybe a list of thousands of people that have participated in this activity, and the FBI has that in their possession? That makes people uncomfortable, and it hopefully makes them think twice about continuing with that habit, because that's what it is. It's a habit. So also, when you talk about John stops, I can comment on the fact that the agents that work for me go out with these guys and participate in these things sometimes, and it scares the living daylights out of those guys when we stop them and question them to get probable cause to go into a place. They usually cooperate immediately, and they give up the information. So it's really kind of a decision-making process on what are we going to do to accomplish our goals, and do we have the resources to prosecute every single John that walks out of a prostitution operation? No, we want cooperation from them, and if they don't cooperate, I think it's probably not going to be as pleasant for them than if they do. And that's just a very common methodology within law enforcement, that you try to force cooperation, and if you get cooperation, then you're going to compromise. And similarly, going back to the previous question, that if a witness that it has value to us is going to be deported, I can tell you that I have never seen a valuable witness in any criminal investigation that the FBI is involved in get deported when that person had value to us in our case.
Al Alborn, Coles District, and this question is for Ms. Johnson-Firth. Clearly, this is covered by the 13th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Traffic Victims Protection Act, which gets reintroduced every year, which to me makes it sound very much like it is obviously a federal responsibility. And I'm thinking of the analog of immigration. It feels like a federal responsibility. Do you, as a lawyer, believe the federal government is living up to applying the resources to solve this problem?
Honestly, no. But not necessarily in the way that you might think. I think the law enforcement is on it. Like I said, I worked with Department of Justice. They worked very hard on the cases. In fact, I have some statistics from the Department of Justice that between 2008 and 2010, it opened 2,515 investigations. And I knew one of the lawyers at DOJ that had headed up one of the first trafficking units. And so I know they care about this issue, and I know the United States government in many ways has taken a lead on trafficking. But, and here's my issue, and it directly relates to immigration. It's what I touched on earlier. You cannot solve this problem just from an enforcement perspective. You have to look at the global conditions that we are living in. And if 80% or more of the world's population lives in abject poverty, and we are demanding cheap goods to live on, and we want to be able to go to Walmart and buy a child's pair of shoes for $5, you are not going to eradicate trafficking in this country as long as there is a huge population boom, people are totally disposable. You can buy a slave for $90 today for a slave that was $40,000 when the United States had slavery. So the numbers are just so overwhelming, and it's so profitable, and globalization has taken over so much, and our demand for cheap goods is so prominent that you can't eradicate it just through enforcement. You've got to look at our trade agreements. You have to hold multinational corporations responsible, which thankfully, Apple has been dealing with that in the last week or so. And actually, I just want to point out that the Department of Labor, which I am going to send them a thank you note for doing this, has actually published a book, a thick book on 122 products that all of us use that have been made with slave labor. And you can find it on their website, and it's incredible. Everything from chocolate to coffee to tennis shoes to sports equipment to Christmas decorations. Almost everything we use in our daily lives, a portion of it has been made with slave labor.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment on that question as well. So the feds aren't getting beat up on this. You hear human trafficking is a federal issue, but in my opinion, it's an issue for all of us in the room, obviously, from whether we're just a citizen or whether we're in law enforcement. Human trafficking is called the hidden crime for a reason. Human trafficking victims don't come running out of a location and jump on a police car and say, I'm the victim of human trafficking, and they don't flag down an FBI agent driving down the street, obviously. That's why I'm such an advocate of awareness among law enforcement. And it works. When 2 years ago, I went to I started this whole thing through an awareness class, an 8-hour awareness class. I went back to my department and said, we've got a problem. We're working with this population, and I'm sure victims are being overlooked on a regular basis because our officers and detectives don't know what to look for. And we initiated a mandatory training program. All 550 sworn members of the Prince William County Police Department were trained. The intel reports and the tips just started rolling in because the officers and detectives knew what to look for. So I think I think the local element is where it's the officer detective that is on the routine traffic stop that notices the person in the back seat that's probably under the control of someone or being exploited, or is in a house of a diplomat and notices a domestic worker that doesn't look like they're being cared for. Whatever it is, that's where these cases come from. And Jim could probably tell you a lot of the cases come from officers and detectives that are just in their daily work that come across trafficking victims.
Hey, my name is Don Scoggins. I'm in the Occoquan district. This question is from another angle. Have you thought about, I'm sure you have, about people who allow themselves to be trafficked so they can come here to the United States because it's so onerous or difficult to go through the normal immigration process? I mean, I've been abroad and I've seen how some people live, and some of them probably wouldn't mind they would want someone to round them up and bring them over, because I guess once they get here, they feel they'll be able to escape or make some kind of way for themselves. So you're looking at it from the victim, but maybe the victim doesn't mind being a victim temporarily, is the way they think. So what about that?
Could I address that? I've done a lot of academic research on trafficking as well as to the legal service side. And my understanding, I'm not a global economist, but I'm pretty familiar with the academic research behind trafficking, and also the clients that I've interviewed. And in the majority of cases, you don't have persons coming here willingly being trafficked victims. They came because they were promised a better life. For instance, World Bank employees. This is great because I've worked with the World Bank a lot on this issue. They have a contract that says what the worker is going to be paid. There's a minimum wage that is required to be met by the World Bank, and the World Bank is actually to monitor how that domestic worker is treated within the home. However, once the person gets here, everything changes. So like a recruiter in Indonesia will go to Jakarta and will recruit that person. Hey, you can be a domestic worker in America and make $800 a month and send that money back home to your family. And then they get to the United States, they're not paid, their passports are taken, they're beaten, they're sexually abused. They didn't sign up to be trafficked. They signed up for a better life, thought that they could come here and work an honest day's work, and be paid, but they didn't realize they were going to be trafficked. That's my perspective. And that differs from smuggling, where you have someone who is uncoerced, paying a coyote to bring him across the border. But I have never met yet in my work or in my reading of academic journals that people willingly sign up to be victims of trafficking, not even for a temporary purpose of being trafficked.
Can I say something too? It's a good question, and it is an issue that comes up frequently. Like I said, we investigated a prostitution operation, and all the prostitutes that were participating were willing participants. When people are brought into the country, the question comes up, I think the only people that would willingly say they will come over here and be prostitutes are probably women that are prostitutes in the country where they originate. The question is how did they become prostitutes over there? And how did they get brought into that realm? But for us, it doesn't matter. Because what's important to us is, are they free to walk away during the time period that they're here, once they're here? In the United States, if you should be able to walk away from anything. You should be able to walk away from a job or an occupation because you decided to do that. And if they can't walk away because of some form of threat or coercion, whether it's economic, administrative, or violence, then it's starting to get into our category. And that's really what matters. And whether it's a street pimp in an inner city who doesn't let his prostitute walk away from her job because he's going to beat her, or it's some domestic person who can't walk away because they're afraid they're going to lose their right to be in the country, they're being coerced to do whatever it is they're being forced to do, and that's what we need to address.
I'm Jeff Brown. I'm from the Gainesville district, and this is not a question, but it's more of a comment relative to Ms. Johnson's comment about international trade.
Jeff, we take questions, so there needs to be a question.
All right.
Put a question mark.
I'll put a question on it. One of the things that I think you have a very profound knowledge of is the law. But what I think you're misunderstanding is the role that international trade and development have in this. And I realize there are some elements. We have been dealing with labor fairness and labor issues in this country for well over 100 years. I won't say we've won the battle, but I think we've gone a long ways. One of the things that I do know, and I don't have the statistics in front of me, but the data is very convincing that international trade and development has had a profound impact in lowering poverty in a number of countries. Not all, and not universally, and certainly not to the standards here in the United States. But the reality of it is that I can appreciate that there are labor issues, and many corporations that are trying to compete in the international marketplace have a real problem with the lack of labor standards that exist in China, to a certain extent in India and other countries. So I guess to conform to the rules, Madam President, I'd like to pose a question of why don't you look at some other issues and utilize international trade as the engine for good as opposed to looking at it as the source of the problem?
I am so glad you made that point. I actually, prior to doing the human rights work that I do now, I worked for an international law firm in Boston, and if you could believe it, I know it's surprising, I was a corporate securities, mergers and acquisition, and an intellectual property lawyer, and so I, especially as an intellectual property lawyer, helped companies retain the highest value of their goods possible. And so I'm very familiar with that side of the equation. I actually did a lot of international joint venture work, both here and in England. And I think what has happened, in my perspective, because I had the corporate perspective for about 9 years, both in England and the United States. And then I came to Washington, D.C. and got involved in the trafficking issue and then on the immigration issue. And I think what has happened, in my view, and again, I'm not an economist expert, But there's a balance that needs to be struck, and I think in many ways the United States has not exercised sort of a balance between our need for capitalism and our need for balance of human rights internationally, not so much in this country. And so, for instance, when a developing country is, and we're seeing this in Greece right now, actually, kind of play out, but when a developing country is struggling to, financially stay afloat and certain conditions are imposed that would require it to open its markets to our free trade, that country may not be able and willing to really go for the full free trade open market, because it may not have the systems in place, its industries may not be developed. And so, for instance, one of my Indonesian clients that was severely trafficked, and I was able to get a T visa for her, she was displaced when Indonesia was economically restructured by the IMF. A lot of the labor that she had access to, the medical care, the education, was eliminated because part of the condition of restructuring was that those government programs not exist anymore. They all be privatized and capitalized. So I think the push for privatization and capitalization around the world in areas where those countries may not be at the same level of development that we are is causing huge displacement for those populations. They can't compete, and they have no alternative but to internationally migrate, whether it's to the United States through lawful immigration or illegal immigration, or, per this conversation tonight, they become very vulnerable and victims of trafficking. So that's my perspective for what it's worth.
Martha, I want to take the moderator prerogative and ask a question of Faye, kind of put a personal face on these young women, their background, and when you meet them, how long does it help you to take them to help them break this cycle, to get out of it, to get the self-esteem? You were telling me about that young woman that's now in college down in Florida. How does that work, or how long does that take for, like I said, give us a little bit of the personal of these young women, if you would.
And I am so glad you did that, because I was about ready to raise my hand to say, what about the children? What about the U.S. children here in the United States of America who are 18 and under, who are sex trafficking? What about them? I mean, they're here. And we need to take ownership that they're here. Yes, the international, and I'm not an attorney, I'm not a law officer, I am a provider. I'm a service provider who care about the children nationwide, but I'm right here working with the young people here. Now, the young lady that he just spoke of, she came to us from the District of Columbia. At the age of 13, she began to run the streets. And when I say run the streets, this young lady was smart enough, street savvy enough to run the street. She was manipulative. She was a schemer. You name it, this young lady was able to do it. To the point now that she's 17, 18 years old, she's very sophisticated in her street skills. But what happened when she came to Youth for Tomorrow, of course she got into a lot of trouble because she was in the juvenile delinquent system in the district. But she had prostitute, run guns, sold drugs, robbed people, you name it. This young lady did it. No one thought this girl was going to survive to see the age of 18, and certainly no one thought she would be off attending college and making good grades. But this young lady did everything you can possibly imagine, and she has no problems telling you what she did. The first thing she'll say, I'm not proud of what I've done. But it took some working to get her to that point because she was resistant. Of course, she came from a dysfunctional family. She was adopted. She was born, her biological mom didn't want her, left her in the hospital at birth. She ended up in the foster care system, which, by the way, is a huge population of young people who end up in sex trafficking here in the United States. They have been through the foster care system. And as we know, as hard as we work, the foster system sometimes fail to foster the children. And that's the bottom line. She was in many different homes, in and out of one home, in and out of facilities and institutions. So again, she came to Youth for Tomorrow by way of a mental hospital. But working with this young lady, it took some time for her to begin to get it. One, that somebody cared for her. Two, somebody wanted to see her be successful in life, knowing she's not going to be a child forever. And one of the things we do know, once you turn 18, legally you're grown. And what happens in the system, whether it's foster care or the juvenile justice system, when you're grown, you're done, per se. And that's pretty much what would have happened to this young lady. But there were so many people that came to her rescue. so many people who heard her story, and the fact that she graduated, it brought tears in the eyes of the majority of people in that auditorium on graduation day, because again, this was a kid that was written off. This would have been a throwaway kid. From foster care to the juvenile justice system, in and out of mental institutions. What else can I say? But thank God, this young lady, she's finishing up her first year at a college down in Daytona Beach, Florida. When she went down, I heard the words, oh, she's not going to make it. We'll give her 1 week. We'll give her 2 weeks. Guess what? 2.7. And then when she was at Youth for Tomorrow, her GPA wasn't that high. But she finally bought into this. Okay, if these people cared enough for me, provided the money for me to go to school, sit me down here, then I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I have a chance to survive. I have a chance at a better life. And that's what happened to this young lady. She'll be coming back. She's had some conversation with the Secretary of Health and Human Services. She has an open invitation to go over to the White House when she comes back to town, which will be soon because school is out for most colleges in May. Another young lady that came to us through the foster care system, her mom sold her for a bag of crack at the age of 18. When she came to my program, she was 16 years old. We were in an art therapy class, and we do a lot of guided imagery. And one of the tasks was to draw what you felt when you listened to a particular song. And I noticed she was crying. I sort of understood why she was crying, because we were talking about family, you talk about love, things that most kids are supposed to be able to experience in order to grow up to have a healthy, mentally healthy life. She didn't have that. She wasn't able to do the exercise, so I was able to pull her outside to talk to her. She was able to say, well, this kicked up or triggered flashbacks. You know, post-traumatic stress, one of the most continuing, damaging things that happened to a young person are the flashbacks. Those memories that pop up out of nowhere that remind you of what you've been through. You can be sitting in class, a flashback show up. You can't focus on what the teacher's trying to educate you on. So therefore, you can't take your test because you're having these flashbacks. So we have numerous cases in terms of young people that are coming in for the services, but you got to have patience. You have to have the dedication, because they will call you everything but your name. You can expect the worst in the beginning, but if you stay in there, and young people have a habit of knowing when you really care about them because of that effort and determination you're going to show as you work with them, and that pretty much bridges the gap in terms of that light bulb going off in their head. Oh, maybe this person does care about me. Maybe they are really here for me and not for a paycheck. Because that's what a lot of, let's be real, you go to work, you do what you need to do to survive. But for this population of young people, you need to go the extra. You need to do the then and the then some if you're really committed to helping them turn their lives around. And I just wanted to share some information with you guys in terms of the rates of children who become sexual commodities here in the United States. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children data shows 100,000 to 293,000 children have become sexual commodities. And we're talking here in the United States. Nationally, 450,000 children run away from home each year. 1 out of every 3 teens on the street will be lured toward prostitution within 48 hours of leaving home. And we're talking here 150,000 children lured into prostitution each year. Now you wonder, these are some large numbers, but guess what? The average age of injury is 12. That's somebody's baby, 12. Even if you're 16, 17, that's still somebody's baby, somebody's child who's being exploited by who knows what. And I say who knows what because I had another young lady who came to us from Florida. She was sex trafficked at the age of 13. She was involved with such heavy, high-level organized crime, if you will. She had to leave the state. Now, we're talking about Florida. We're talking about a young teenager. She came to Youth for Tomorrow. She was placed with us for she was there maybe about 2 weeks because she ran. But when she came, she never had traditional help in terms of mental health services to help her begin to regain her senses or to come to know who she is or deprogram her, if you will. She had been out on the streets and she had experienced some horrific situations to the point where she came with sex addiction, drug addiction, nicotine addiction. Had not been to school, 13, 14 years old. This is real stuff. This is what we're dealing with right here in the United States, let alone right here in Prince William County. The need is tremendous. People always ask me, well, what can we do to help? Well, mentors. The young girls need mentors. They need people who they can confide in. Yes, they have the therapists. Yes, they have the counselors. If they're living in residential or in a group home, they have the house parents and other residential staff. But they still need that one-on-one person. Restoration Ministries is a group out of D.C. who tends to come out and they bond one-on-one with some of the young ladies because they work with sex trafficking victims as well. So in addition to that, trying to provide specialized service, because again, this is a heartfelt service. You have to be in this from the heart, and you have to be able to roll with the punches, if you will, because this is a high population to work with, especially if the young ladies have been out on the street for a long period of time, to the point where they have been brainwashed to feel that no one loves me, I don't care about myself. And the sad piece about all of that is the fact that when they run away from home, they're either running away from something or they're running to something. Family dysfunction, again, on the social service level, as far as families getting the help that they need to help keep families together. And one of my philosophies always has been children grow better in families. Well, then that puts us at another disadvantage because we do have disadvantaged families. But again, it's about having that heartfelt determination, commitment, and dedication to work with any of these kids. And we cannot forget the boys. And for whatever reason, boys don't get as much attention as the girls who are trafficked. Because if you go to D.C. any Friday or Saturday night and drive down 14th Street or Rhode Island Avenue, you see what you see. You see boys and girls out there, young boys out there with the young girls engaged in trafficking. They're being forced as much as the girls are.
Faye, how long does the average, and it's somebody's child, which I think is good you remind us, how long will the average child stay at Youth for Tomorrow? Is it 6 months? Is it a year?
And see, that's the sad thing, funding. When kids come to us from one of our neighboring localities, they normally give them 6 to 9 months. And of course, that's not enough time because by the time you get to the 6th month, you're really just beginning to bridge the triggers, the flashbacks, the nightmares, all those things that cause that young person to act out. We're just beginning to hit it. And then it's time for them to go. And what happens in some cases, they end up back on the street. Now, we've had several young ladies who come back to us because if they leave and they're midway of their treatment process, they ask to come back. Now, when Youth for Tomorrow can, they will scholarship a sex trafficking victim because we know to make a difference in that young person's life, we need to go the distance.
Martha, you want to try another question?
Who was first at this table?
Hello, I'm Diane Bennett. I'm president of Disruptors International of Manassas. And I just have a question. We're talking about teenagers and targeting teenagers. Are there any programs that approach the schools to educate the kids on the problems with trafficking and the hazards?
Well, I can speak because I'm here in Prince William County. One of the things we're working on doing now is trying to become partners with the school system so that we can go in not only to have groups and opportunities for the young people, but for the teachers as well. There are organizations in place who are going around to different social service agencies because they're not that knowledgeable about just what sex trafficking is. Because for a long time, the kids have been considered criminals as opposed to victims, and they end up in the juvenile justice system, where we're just beginning to really turn that thing around to the point where they are seen as victims and not criminals. But it's a fine line in terms of actually knowing what you're looking for, in terms of whether it is a child who's out there being prostituted or sex trafficking, or if it's something else. So is that something else that we need to bridge the gap in terms of providing education to that level, the school system as well as social service agencies?
What level are you contacting the school systems? Superintendent's level?
Yes, ma'am. We are in contact with the powers that be. We just began with the Crisis Intervention Counseling Program. We just began to fill in the gap to assist with the Community Service Bureau when children are in mental health crisis. Because when young people who are trafficking are ready to come in, they need somebody to talk to. Because again, that's mental health, it's sex abuse. So they need help. So we're already at that level in terms of working with young people coming in off of the street, young people who have not been known to any other agency, but that young person belongs in somebody's school. And they need special treatment if we're going to help to deprogram them and get them moving in the right direction.
Okay.
One thing that
Jim's going to adjust the ringing microphone up there. And then, Jesse, you have the next question.
like to comment on that with what what we did. We reached out to the Head Start program reached out to us for training, and we were able to. They do a lot. They're in a lot of homes, and they're dealing with families, and they wanted to know indicators, and we provided training for them. And there was legislation that was passed for mandatory human trafficking training in schools, and I'm sure that's going to lead to more cases being developed. So another thing that we're doing, Faye brought up all the cases. A lot of our victims are runaways, physically, sexually abused at home. And one thing that I'm working at with our department is when a juvenile runs away, is reported as missing, and then returns home, there's mandatory questions that juvenile needs to be asked. And what we want to do is start targeting not only were you physically or sexually abused when you were gone or before you left. Well, that might not be the right question, because if the juvenile engaged in commercial sex, they might think, that was kind of consensual, so they might answer no. But we want to open up. The school resource officers are more, now that they've all been trained in the indicators. They're aware that our runners, our kids that are running a lot, are susceptible to this. And Faye brought up some very 3 cases or 3 or 4 cases. Some of them are kind of extreme, and I don't want anyone to leave this room and think, it's only the kids that just got a rough start in life that end up in this. That's not the case. A lot of the cases that I've dealt with, and when you start looking at and you start seeing the case studies, physically or sexually abused at home at a very young age, run away. When they run away, where are they going to go? They don't go to the country or a rural area. They go somewhere where there's a population. They go somewhere where they think they're going to make a life for themselves. They get there, there's no support structure, there's no money. And what they start to do is they start to engage in survival sex. Well, how, if they need to provide a sexual act to get money to eat that night, okay? They didn't plan on, I'm going to run away and I'm going to go engage in commercial sex in the city. But it becomes a survival technique. Well, how long do they have to engage in that activity before they come in contact with a pimp who's going to take them under the arm, take them under the wing, show them the love and affection that wasn't shown for them at home? There's 2 types of pimps. There's the guerrilla pimp that just beats his victims into submission and says, you're going to do what I tell you to do. And then there's the finesse pimps. Well, the guerrilla pimp, if he beats his victim, he's opening himself up to criminal liability. It's very much easier to prove what's going on. The finesse pimp is more the way the world is going now. And it's a lot of the girls will tell you, I met this guy at the mall. He offered to buy me food. He offered to buy me clothes. We dated. We courted for like 2 weeks. And then one day he came to me and said, hey, we're in a bad situation. I'd hate to see you have to do this, but this guy is telling me that he'll give us money if you perform this sex act. I love you. I don't want to see you do it, but you're doing this for us. We can make a better life together. Picture that scenario. It's not the pimp on the street coming up to a young girl and saying, do you want to be a prostitute? And the girl saying yes. That's where the coercion and the fraud come into play. So I want to make sure that it's not just any runaway youth is susceptible to falling into this.
Okay, we've got 4 hands that have been up. We're running over time, and we started late, so if our panel is willing to stay in place, we'll finish up with those 4, and it's Jesse, Carol, AJ, and we'll wind up with Delegate Anderson. Do you still have a question? Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Jesse Barringer, Gainesville. I just have a question for Agent Haverty. You mentioned something about magazine crews. I don't know what they are. Can you just explain it shortly?
Well, neither do we. Well, we're learning. Anytime you have someone engaged in employment where they aren't free to leave, that's an area we're looking at. And magazine crews are another operation that we're now looking at. You see these kids come up and they're selling magazines, or they're selling products, cleaning products, candy, whatever, and there's usually somebody floating around in the vicinity that's keeping an eye on them. And it's not like my kids' high school where they're selling, coupons for the band or for their sports team. These kids are out there selling, and you kind of get the feeling when they walk away like that seemed like it was kind of a for-profit operation. Well, that's another example. It's not sex trafficking, it's labor trafficking. They may not have the freedom to leave. They're being coerced to continue to be in this group. Then the interesting thing about these groups of people is they would follow the old school concept of gypsy operations. They travel, they go around, and not only they're like a little mini human crime wave. They roll into town, they hit a neighborhood, they sell stuff, but if they see a car that's not locked, they're going to boost stuff out of the car. Or once they get back to their hotel room, they may go out and commit some petty crime while they're in town. And they may run scams or do other things as well. But the real issue here is based on our study of them, they're not, a lot of these kids that get involved with them are not free to leave and not free to just walk away. And there's a lot of different types of operations like that we also have to look at. The challenge with an operation like that is they're migratory. If there's a better term. I mean, it's hard to focus on a criminal operation when it's constantly moving and crossing jurisdictional boundaries. Now, even that's probably an area where we should be specialized in that and to focus on that. But if the majority of their criminal activity is kind of petty and not really significant, they don't come up on our radar. So there has to be a reason to come up on our radar, and I think human trafficking may be what brings them up onto our radar. But we would have, what we're trying to figure out how to do is, what we need to do is track them, is to identify them, identify their criminal activity, and then follow them as they go from city to city, and then pass that off to the next office and say, hey, Sacramento, these guys were in Prince William County, and now they've driven their vehicle out to you, and they're coming their way, or they're here and they're there. We had a similar problem back, 15 years ago, 10 years ago with we actually had tinkers in the United States that had migrated over here, and they were doing similar things. And so that's it's like a little mini gang, and you don't just walk away from the gang.
I had the opportunity to recover a victim in a sales crew. And again, it comes down to awareness. Normally when we get calls for solicitors, hey, there's kids going door to door, we go out and, in this case it's adults, and we ask them, do you have a solicitor's permit? No. All right, well, hey, you need a solicitor's permit. If you don't have one, you need to get down the road kind of thing. Again, awareness. We talked about these scenarios in our training and based on FBI investigations. So, patrol officers end up with a sales crew, with a soap crew, and they're like, something's not right here. They call me at home. They said, hey, something's not right. I go out. I start interviewing these kids. I call them kids, but they're in their early 20s. We talk about human trafficking being all about exploitation, and it's economic and intent. All these young people were from the inner city and were all convicted felons. Hard to find a job when you're a convicted felon. That was their way of kind of pulling them into the sales crew. Every morning, they stayed at the same hotel. Every morning, they had team leaders that would wake them up at a certain time, make sure they were dressed, and they would go to a motivational meeting. That motivational meeting would consist of, we're your family now. A little bit of brainwashing mixed in. They were given quotas. If he didn't sell so much product a day, he was locked in his room at night without dinner. And I asked him, I said, do you want to do this? He said, no. And he said the magic words, they treat me like a slave. And that's what they were doing. And I was able to recover him. So, great example.
I have one more,
outside the box.
One more example, and this is actually not from the law enforcement perspective, but I got involved because I was law enforcement. I actually had a neighbor come to me when I was living in San Diego, and this isn't, I like to fancy my neighborhood as an upper middle class neighborhood. I certainly didn't belong there being a government employee, but I somehow managed to wiggle my way in. And these are well-to-do people. There's nice cars driving around the neighborhood, and they actually called me up there and asked me to talk to their daughter because she got involved in selling perfume at the mall for a crew of people, and she had been staying with these people. And so the father asked me to sit down and talk to this daughter and hear the circumstances for which, under which she was employed, and hear the description of it, and just tell her what I thought. And I sat and I listened to her to describe, and there were certain symptoms that pretty much lay it down. They were not allowed to call their family. They were not allowed to tell their family how much money they made. They were constantly being told they need to be there all the time, and they need to go out, sell the perfume at the mall, like, outside the mall in the parking lot, or, like orbiting around. And there was all these conditions and all these things that they had been told that they couldn't do, but they were being promised that they were going to get their own business and they were going to make a lot of money and blah, 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 blah. But it was definitely that control and coercion element to it. And all I said to this girl is I said, it's very simple. If somebody tells you in the United States that you can't call your family and talk to them, you need to walk away because there's something wrong. If somebody says they're holding your money and they don't give it to you, that doesn't happen in the United States. There's something wrong with that. You get paid for labor in the United States, and if you're not getting it, it's a problem. And I basically told this kid, you are in a bad situation, and you need to walk away now, meaning you don't go back. You're in your home now. You're lucky you're here. Don't go back. You're done. That's my opinion, and I'm going to go home and eat my dinner now. Thank you very much. It was nice talking to you all, and thank you for the beer. And I left. And I think it helped that they actually had an FBI agent that could walk into their house because he lived down the street, could basically slap the kid in the face a little bit and say, no, what you're talking about is crazy and you need to get out. But that is kind of the example of some of the scams that are occurring that are what I would call maybe trafficking light. They're not, I don't know that somebody's going to get beaten up and abused if they try to walk away, but there's definitely that subtle element of coercion.
Yes, Carol Noggle on the Gainesville District. And I really want to go home with something to do. Mr. Haverty talked about being on the radar. Obviously, in this county, we're not seeing this on the radar. And it seems to me you're naming a lot of scenarios that somehow needs to get out to the public, not just in the school and not just in law enforcement. And so you have a training program. How can we spread that?
The one thing that we've tried to do with the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force at this point is more of a working group. We've put in for Department of Justice funding. We're hoping to receive our grant. But it's been very active on the law enforcement side of the house. We've really worked doing law enforcement training. And one thing that I've been trying to establish is a community awareness and outreach program. I'll speak on an event like this, and I'll have people come up. They're very interested in the topic, and the head of the task force is very aware of that. We want to get that started. It's just that he's got a caseload. We're all working active cases. We're working investigations, but we need to get that committee established and active to help in community awareness, and we are working towards that.
One thing, and we had a press conference down in Richmond, and a lady talked to us that runs one of the organizations in Richmond, and she said, understand, there's no act of informing the public that's too small. And she said, some people, if we're not doing this grand event, it's not worth doing. But she said, it's like, hey, put it on, if you've got a Facebook page, put it on your Facebook page. If you've got a link, Lisa mentioned, Polaris, their webpage. Send it to 10 of your friends. Send a link to 10 of your friends on Shared Hope. Help out Youth for Tomorrow. I mean, we all want to do the big things, but there's little things, because the thing is, you might send that one email, and that person might stumble across, as they've been saying, and see something that's out of place and call the police. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us. We don't have 100 people here tonight or 200 people here, but the 40 or 50 of us that are here can make a little difference by just letting our networks of folks know. And then it's kind of I always think it's like a rock that you throw in the pond and the ripples go out.
I just want to add something. I touched on earlier some action items that you could be a part of. I do recommend this report, the Protected Innocence Initiative, that I found online. And that I told you Virginia was given an F for its legislation gaps on trafficking. And one of the important gaps is the lack of real protection for domestic minor sex trafficking in Virginia. And so if you take a look at that report, again, contact your representatives and get some of the bills passed in Virginia to bring Virginia up to where many of the other states in the country are. And Virginia, by the way, is one of the top trafficking states in the country. You know, we've got California, Texas, Florida, New Jersey. Virginia and Washington, D.C. are part of the top 10. And we don't have adequate legislation on the books.
And the minor sex trafficking was our bill that this year that we passed out. So we'll keep working on that too. But thank you for pointing that out.
A.J. Jones, Gainesville District. I want to turn it around a little bit. There's a demand which we don't know how to stop, but there is a supply. What if we legalize prostitution? What's the effect?
Lisa, are you familiar with? I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, please put me on the spot. Because I actually have some thoughts about this.
Yeah, being that commercial sex kind of fuels trafficking, I can't remember the country, but one of the countries that did legalize prostitution, and it did show that there was an increase in trafficking along with that. Unfortunately, it didn't make the problem go away. But I do hear that a lot, and I wish I was more familiar with the actual statistics. But I don't know if you were aware of it. I can't remember which country it was that legalized prostitution, and maybe they criminalized the act of soliciting on the street. But it did not have a positive
it's legal
effect.
in Colombia.
True.
Colombia.
Holland.
Yeah,
Yes.
lots of them. Yeah.
I think at the very least it's worth a discussion, and I'm glad you brought it up because when I was working at a nonprofit, particularly Tahari Justice Center, we got VALA funding, Violence Against Women Act protection funding, and I often gave presentations on human trafficking and domestic violence and all the ways that women are vulnerable, and it makes women, and I say women because women and children do make up the greatest percentage of trafficked persons, both domestically and internationally. And so when we're not talking about alternatives, that's a problem. And there were gag orders in our grant from the federal government that we could not say what you just said. Had I have said what you just said, I would have been fired. Because we could have potentially lost our federal grant to do the work that we were doing. And so to not have a conversation at all and just call it taboo is, I think, the wrong approach, and I'm glad that you brought it up. I honestly can't say what the best solution is. I've seen pros and cons either way. I do have a problem that the demand side is not being dealt with. I think it should be dealt with. I would even go so far, I might be stepping out on a limb here, to say it's sexist that's not being dealt with. But, you know, in terms of legalizing prostitution, I think there's very strong arguments on both sides of that equation. But at the very least, we need to be talking about it. And a lot of the federal programs, especially when Bush was president, because he was like the forerunner on trafficking, just stopped the conversation from happening at all.
I'd like to share a story that one of the trainers that I work with from Polaris Project shares her experience with coming in contact with a human trafficking victim at a very young age. And she was an Army, I don't want to say Army brat. I don't want to offend anyone that grew up as an Army, you know, as someone that...
We're proud.
Yeah, good. Should be. But at any rate, she got on the train and went up into the red light district. Obviously, she had heard of this red light district. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she wanted to see what it was. And she got on the train and she made it up there. And she made contact with the first woman that was engaging in commercial sex, standing on the road there. And she made conversation with her. And this woman was from another European country. She had a master's degree, and she spoke 3 languages. And she had answered an ad to work in this country under a visa program. And when she got there, she was compelled into prostitution against her will. Well, the young female that was talking to her, couldn't understand. She's like, "You're a woman. You're smart. You speak multiple languages. You have you should be able to just leave." Meanwhile, this woman's controller, her pimp, is standing across the street looking at them, and eventually approached and said, "Do you have a problem?" And this girl, the woman working in commercial sex, said she was asking for directions. But she walked away and realized that woman, although well-educated and had all those qualities, wasn't able to escape the situation. And that was a situation where she was in commercial sex in a place that it was legal. So there, just a story about how trafficking can exist even in a place where it's legal.
My first thought in your suggestion, I'm a very analytical person. I was an engineer before I went into the FBI, so I always cut things apart very analytically and logically. I'm not Spock, but I'm close. And the first thing I thought is, how would that work? How would that affect us? What would we do? And how would the problem change? And my first thought was, well, there's still going to be human trafficking, because there's always going to be need, because what's going to happen if you legalize prostitution is it's going to be restricted, and it's going to be limited in what the prostitutes can do, where they can go, not near my church, not near my business, not near this, not near a school. It's going to be restricted to an area. The activities are going to be restricted, and the needs and wants of the customers are always going to exceed what the law is going to allow, and somebody's going to have to fill that need. So there's still going to be people that are going to be coercers. You're not going to, and like he described, you're not going to get rid of the problem. You're just going to change it. It's going to be different, but it's still going to be there. So I don't view legalization as a solution to the overall problem that we're talking about here.
Okay, I know there are a couple of people who have put their hands up, and we are way over time at this point, and I said Delegate Anderson would have the very last question, so it's up to you.
Rich Anderson, Occoquan District. Carol Noggle sort of touched on this, and you have also, Lisa. I'm here, aside from the fact I'm a Committee of 100 member, but because I know little about this issue, and I found out it's very pervasive here in one of the most affluent sections of America. Not only is it in our backyard, it sounds like it's happening in our front yard. And so what can people like Delegate Hugo, myself, our legislative colleagues, you've somewhat touched on this, do to take this to the point of action through the legislative process? Because as you say, we haven't gotten very high marks on this in the Commonwealth. And so I'd rather be part of the solution than to continue the problem.
Well, just in my opinion, a lot of the states have modeled some of their provisions after the federal law. And Polaris Project actually has some model legislation that's quite comprehensive on their website. So at the very least, maybe begin to explore other state laws and what they've passed, particularly in the states that are hardest hit by trafficking, and the federal law, of course, and see how that has played out. Maybe begin to interview Department of Justice or FBI officials, for a while and really find out how it works in practice and how Virginia could draft some model legislation, because there's a lot of different aspects to it that need to be covered. I think just even looking at the Polaris Project website, their model legislation is a good first start.
I have a comment. Even though I'm with the federal government, I can still comment on some things. I personally don't have a dissatisfaction with the laws in place. They are not a problem for us, for what we do. Our biggest challenge is resources, and that's the constant battle in any area that we're working is allocating the resources over or in conflict with all the other priorities that, say, for example, the FBI has: national security, white-collar crime, public corruption, and all the other things that we deal with. So we have that challenge of resources. There's a lot more we could do if we had more resources. So what we have to do is we have to rely on task forces and other agencies to be force multipliers for us, and we work together to work the problem as a group. So empowering, people within the state government or the local governments to do more makes us more effective as well. And that's really what we need, is we need everybody to work on it. And I personally feel that the FBI has a lot of support with the Congress in addressing this problem. So, we're in pretty good shape. So, but like she said, modeling after what we have, the only issue we have is resources. The decision to target more bodies after this problem, and that's something that happens through a process similar to making sausage. You probably wouldn't want to watch it, but it happens and it occurs, and that's, people have to decide that this is something we want to make a priority.
One issue that we see on the local level is a lot of, I think some agencies get frustrated working the prostitution cases because the people engaging in commercial sex get smarter and smarter with the laws and make it harder for us to make our cases. And I felt this frustration working undercover and working prostitution. And I've heard there is some rumblings in Richmond in certain offices where they want to change the whole furtherance of the act in the prostitution statute. As an undercover, it's not just good enough that we speak of sex for money, but there has to be a furtherance of that act for me to make the criminal charge. And when I walk into a room and the female believes that I'm just a paying customer, and asks me, put your 120 rose donation on the table, please. I didn't make a case right there, and now I need to make a furtherance of the act to make my case. And I think there could some shift in the wording of the statute might assist us in making these cases and take away that frustration where more departments might actively work the issue. And again, not all prostitution is human trafficking, but as we see, we find human trafficking within commercial sex.
Faye, you want to take a last word?
Yes. I have this article that I just wanted to share with everybody. This came out in the news maybe a couple of weeks ago. Again, just to bring this home in terms of our high schools, our middle schools, maybe even our elementary schools. 5 alleged members of Crips gang accused of prostituting high school girls. 11 area gang members have been charged with juvenile sex trafficking since 2011. Now, we've heard a lot about the MS-13 because, of course, they use sex trafficking more so than the drugs in terms of keeping their income going. But now we're talking about a group called the Underground Gangster Crips, based out of Fairfax County, next door. And I would surmise that we also have groups or gangs right here in Prince William County that's doing the same thing. We just haven't uncovered their location and exactly what they're doing, because work with some of the young ladies from Prince William County now who were sex trafficked, who are now trying to get themselves back into the flow of society and living their lives as young people. They're sharing things that sometimes, Barry, I don't want to hear it, especially when they're telling me about the hotels on Route 1 where sex trafficking is going on with young girls. Route 1 in Woodbridge. This is the information they're sharing. But we need them to share that information to other folks, such as these 2 individuals sitting here and the young lady on the end here, because I am a service provider. My job is to help them feel better, to do better, and get themselves on track, because they are going to grow up and they're not going to be young and pretty forever. And I just told a young lady that yesterday who just recently came in from the streets. That it's time for you to make a decision. We can't force anybody, but we certainly can put the information out there and show them that we care enough to help them get out of this life.
Well, everyone, look, I think you've heard from a variety of perspectives and backgrounds tonight. And I think all 4 of our panelists thank you, because I think we're all convinced that you're working hard every day to stem the scourge of trafficking. Lisa points out we've got a lot of work to do in Virginia, and I think I can say Democrats and Republicans are going to continue this fight because it's a tragic and heartbreaking fight. And it's tragic and heartbreaking because it's happening in Prince William and Fairfax and every county, every corner of the Commonwealth. And I hope you go away tonight being able to say something to somebody, because this can happen to anyone. It can happen to any family, and no type of family is immune. So to the Committee of 100, thank you so much for putting this on. A special thank you to all our panelists.
A big thank you to our panelists, and it's rare that we run overtime like this, and we wouldn't have unless you were really, really interested. So we appreciate learning what you do every day that we had no idea about. And a special thank you to Delegate Hugo, not only for being here tonight, but working on this issue in the General Assembly.